This is just me trying to create that scene of these two anthropologists right now, Nell and her husband Fen, and they are leaving this violent tribe that I call the Mbano, and they're thinking that they're going to go to Australia. As they were leaving the Mbano, someone threw something at them. It bobbed a few yards from the stern of the canoe, a pale brown thing. "Another dead baby," Fen said. He had broken her glasses by then, so she didn't know if he was joking. Ahead lay the bright break in the curve of dark green land where the boat would go. She concentrated on that. She did not turn around again. The few Mbano on the beach were singing and beating the death gong for them, but she didn't look at them a last time. Every now and then, when the four rowers, all standing, calling back to their people or out to other canoes, pulled at the same time, a small gust of wind struck her damp skin. Her lesions prickled and tightened as if hurrying to heal in the brief, dry air. The wind stopped and started. She could feel the gap between sensation and recognition of it, and knew that the fever was coming on again. The rowers ceased rowing to stab a snake-necked turtle and haul it into the boat, still writhing. Behind her, Fen hummed a dirge for the turtle, too low for anyone but her to hear. A motorboat was waiting for them where the Youat met the Sepik. There were two white couples on board with the driver, a man named Minton, whom Fen knew from Carnes. The women wore stiff dresses and silk stockings, the men dinner jackets. They did not complain about the heat, which meant they lived here, the men overseeing either plantations or mines or enforcing the laws that protected them. At least they weren't missionaries. She couldn't have tolerated a missionary today. One woman had bright gold hair, the other eyelashes like black ferns. Both carried beaded purses. The smooth white of their arms looked fake. She wanted to touch the one closer to her, push up her sleeve and see how far up the white went, the way all her tribes, wherever she went, needed to touch her when she first arrived. She saw pity in the women's gazes as she and Fen boarded with their dirty duffels and their malarial eyes. The engine, when it started up, was so loud, so startling, that her hands rose to her ears like a child's. She saw Fen flinch to do the same, and she smiled reflexively, but he didn't like that she'd noticed and moved away from her to talk to Minton. She took a seat on the bench at the stern with the women. "What's the occasion?" she asked Tilly, the gold-haired one. If she'd had hair like that, the natives would never have stopped touching. You couldn't go into the field with hair like that. They both managed to hear her over the engine and laughed. "It's Christmas Eve, silly." They had been drinking already, though it couldn't have been much past noon, and it would have been easier to be called silly if she hadn't been wearing a filthy cotton shift over Fen's pajamas. She had the lesions, a fresh gash on her hand from a sago palm thorn, a weakness in her right ankle, the old Solomon neuritis in her arms, and an itchy sting between her toes that she hoped wasn't another batch of ringworm. She could normally keep the discomfort at bay while she was working, but it kicked in hard watching these women in their silks and their pearls. "Do you think Lieutenant Boswell will be there?" Tilly asked the other woman. "She thinks he's divine." This one, Eva, was taller, stately, bare-fingered. "I do not, and so do you," Tilly said. "But you are a married woman, my dear." "Well, you can't expect someone to stop noticing people the minute the ring goes on," Tilly said. "I don't, but your husband certainly does." In her mind, Nell was writing. Ornamentation of neck, wrists, fingers, paint on face only, emphasis on lips, dark red, and eyes, black, hips emphasized by cinching of waist, conversation competitive. The valued thing is the man, not having one necessarily, but having the ability to attract one. She couldn't stop herself. "Have you been studying the natives?" Tilly asked her. "No, she's come from the twilight ball at Floating Palais." "I have," she said, "since July. I mean, the July before this last one." "A year and a half up that little tributary somewhere?" Tilly said. "Good God," Eva said. A year first in the mountains north of here with the Anapa," Nell said. "Then another 5.5 months with the Mbano up the Youat. We left early. I didn't like them." "Like them?" Eva said. "I would think keeping your head attached to your neck might be a more reasonable goal." "Were they cannibals?" It was not safe to give them an honest answer. She did not know who their men were. "No, they fully understand and abide by the new laws." "They're not new," Eva said. "They were issued 4 years ago." "I think to an ancient tribe it all feels new, but they obey and blame all their bad luck on the lack of homicide." "Did they talk about it?" Tilly said. She wondered why every white asked about cannibalism. She thought of Fen when he returned from the 10-day hunt, his sad attempt to keep it from her. "I tasted it," he finally blurted out, "and they're right, it does taste like old pig." It was a joke the Mbano had, that the missionaries had tasted like old pig. They speak of it with great longing. The two women, even long brazen Eva, shrank a bit. Then Tilly asked, Did you read the book about the Solomon Islands? Where all the children are fornicating in the bushes? Eva! I did, and then Nell couldn't help herself. Did you like it? Oh, I don't know, Tilly said. I don't understand what all the fuss is about. Is there fuss? Nell said. She hadn't heard anything about its reception in Australia. I'll say. She wanted to ask by whom and about what, but one of the men were coming around with an enormous bottle of gin, refilling glasses. Your husband said you wouldn't want any, he said to her apologetically, for he did not have a glass for her. Fen had his back to her, but she could see the expression on his face just from the way he was standing, with his back arched and his heels slightly lifted. He would be compensating for his wrinkled clothing and his odd profession with a hard, masculine glare. He would allow himself a small smile only if he himself had made the joke. Fortified by several sips, Tilly continued her inquiry. And what will you write about these tribes? It's all a jumble in my head still. I never know anything until I get back to my desk in New York. She was aware of her own impulse to compete, to establish dominance over these clean, pretty women by conjuring up a desk in New York. Is that where you're headed back now? To your desk? Her desk, her office, the diagonal window that looked out onto Amsterdam and 118th Street. Distance could feel like a terrible claustrophobia at times. No, we're going to Victoria next to study the Aborigines. Tilly pulled a pout. You poor thing, you look beat up enough as it is. We can tell you right here all you need to know about the Abos, Eva said. It was just this last 5 months, this last tribe. She couldn't think of how to describe them. She and Fen hadn't agreed on one thing about the Mbano. He had stripped her of her opinions. She marveled now at the blankness. Tilly was looking at her with a drunk's depthless concern. Sometimes you just find a culture that breaks your heart, she said finally. Nellie, Fen called to her. Minton says Bankson's still here. He waved his hand upriver. Of course he is, she thought, but said, The one who stole your butterfly net? She was trying to be playful. He didn't steal anything. What had he said exactly? It had been on the ship coming home from the Solomons. In one of their first conversations, they'd been gossiping about their old professors. Haddon had liked me, Fen had said, but he gave Bankson his butterfly net. Bankson had ruined their plans. They'd come in 31 to study 2 New Guinea tribes. Because Bankson was on the Sepik River, they'd gone north up the mountains to the Anapa, with the hope that when they came back down in a year, he'd be gone and they'd have their pick of the river tribes, whose less isolated cultures were rich with artistic, economic, and spiritual traditions. But he was still there, so they'd gone the opposite direction from him and the Kiona he studied, south down a tributary of the Sepik called the Uat, where they'd found the Mbano. She had known that tribe was a mistake after the first week, but it took her 5 months to convince Fen to leave. Fen stood beside her. We should go and see him. Really? He'd never suggested this before. Why now? When they had already made arrangements for Australia. He had been with Haddon, Bankson, and the butterfly net in Sydney 4 years ago, and she didn't think they had liked each other much. Bankson's Kiona were warriors, the rulers of the Sepik before the Australian government had tracked down, separating villages, allotting them parcels of land they did not want, throwing resistors in jail. The Mbano, fierce warriors themselves, told tales of the Kiona's prowess. This was why he wanted to visit Bankson. The tribe is always greener on the other side of the river, she often tried to tell him, but it was impossible not to be envious of other people's people. Unless you laid it out neatly on the page, your own tribe looked a mess. Do you think we'll see him in Angoram, she asked. They couldn't go traipsing after Bankson. They'd made the decision to go to Australia. Their money wouldn't last much more than half a year, and it would take several weeks to get settled among the Aborigines. Doubt it. I'm sure he steers clear of the government station. The speed of the boat was disorienting. We need to get that pinnace to Port Moresby tomorrow, Fen. The Gunai are a good choice for us. You thought the Mbano were a good choice for us, too, when we headed there. He rattled the ice of his empty glass. He looked like he had more to say, but he walked back to Minton and the other men. Been married long? Asked Tilly. 2 years in May, Nell said. We had the ceremony the day before we came out here. Swish honeymoon. They laughed. The bottle of gin came round again. For the next 4.5 hours, Nell watched the dressed-up couples drink, tease, flirt, wound, laugh, apologize, separate, reintegrate. She watched their young, uneasy faces, saw how thin the layer of self-confidence was, how easily it slipped off when they thought no one was looking. Occasionally, Tilly's husband would raise his arm to point out something on land. 2 boys with a net, a quail hanging like a melting sack from a tree, an osprey coasting to its nest, a red parrot mocking the engine. She tried not to think about the villages they were passing, the raised houses and the fire pits and the children hunting for snakes in the thatch with spears. All the children she was missing, the tribes she would never know and words she would never hear, the worry that they right now might be passing the one people she was meant to study, a people whose genius she would unlock and who would unlock hers, a people who had a way of life that made sense to her. Instead, she watched these Westerners, and she watched Fenn speaking his hard talk to the men, aggressively pressing them about their work, defensively responding when they asked about his, coming to seek her out, then punishing her with a few cutting words and an abrupt retreat. He did this 4 or 5 times, dumping his frustration on her, unaware of his own pattern. He was not through punishing her for wanting to leave the Mombano. "He's handsome, isn't he? Your husband," Eva said when no one else could hear. "I bet he cleans up well." The boat slowed, the water glowed salmon pink in the sunset, and they were there. 3 dock boys dressed in white pants, blue shirts, and red caps came running out from the Angoram Club to tie up the boat. "Look how long," Mitten barked at them in pidgin. "Isi, isi." To each other they spoke in their tribal language, Tawe most likely. To the disembarking passengers they said, "Good evening," in a crisp British accent. She wondered how far their knowledge of English extended. "How are you this evening?" she asked the biggest boy. "Fine, thank you, madam." He reminded her of their Anapashute boy with his easy confidence and willingness to smile. "It's Christmas Eve, I hear." "Yes, madam." "Do you celebrate it?" "Oh, yes, ma'am." The missionaries had gotten to them then. "And what are you hoping for?" she asked the second biggest. "A fishing net, ma'am." He tried to keep the sentence brief and dispassionate like the other boys, but he burst out, "Like the one my brothers got last year." "And the first thing he catched for me," the littlest cried out. All 3 boys laughed, their teeth bright white. At their age, most Mombano boys no longer had many teeth, having lost them to rot or fights, and the ones that remained were stained scarlet by the betel nut they chewed. Just as the big boy began to explain, Fenn called to her from the ramp. The white couples already up on the land seemed to be laughing at them, at the woman in the filthy man's pajamas trying to talk to the natives, at the gaunt bearded Aussie who may or may not clean up well, teetering with their bags, calling for his wife. She told the boys to have a Merry Christmas, which they thought was funny, and they wished her the same. She would have liked to squat on that dock with those boys all night. Fenn, she saw, was not mad. He shifted both bags onto his left shoulder and offered her his right arm, as if she too were wearing an evening dress. She slipped her left arm through, and he clamped down. The lesion she had there stung from the pressure. "It's Christmas Eve, for Christ's sake. Must you always be working?" But his voice was teasing now, almost apologetic. "We are here," his arm tight around hers said. "It is over with the Mombano." He kissed her, and this too made the pain flare, but she didn't complain. He didn't like her strong, nor did he like her weak. Many months ago, he'd grown tired of sickness and sores. When his fever rose, he took 45-mile hikes. When he had a thick white worm growing beneath his skin, the skin of his leg, he cut it out himself with a penknife. They were given a room on the 2nd story. Music from the club's dining room below vibrated in the floorboards. She touched one of the twin beds. It was made up with stiff white sheets and a fat pillow. She pulled the top sheet from its tight bind and got in. It was just an old, narrow army cot, but it felt like a cloud, a clean, smooth, starched cloud. She felt sleep, the old, heavy kind, the kind of her childhood come for her. "Good idea," Fenn said, taking off his shoes. There was a whole bed for him, too, but he pushed his way in beside her, and she had to turn toward him on her side so as not to fall off. "Time to procreate," he said in the sing-song. So I'm just, going to very delicately skip over this extremely unpleasant sex scene. You can read that at home. I will just continue on. The small sections of her flesh that did not hurt were numb. Let me try that again. The small section of her flesh that did not hurt were numb, if not dead. Fenn pumped against her. When it was over, he said, "There's your baby." "At least a leg or 2, she said, as soon as she could trust her voice. He laughed. The Mombano believed it took many times to make a whole baby. "We'll get to the arms later tonight." He swiveled her face to hers and kissed her. "Now let's get ready for that party." There was an enormous Christmas tree in the far corner. It looked real, as if they'd shipped it from New Hampshire. The room was crowded with men mostly, owners and overseers, river drivers and government kiaps, crocodile hunters with their smelly taxidermists, traders, smugglers, and a few hard-drinking ministers. The pretty women from the boat seemed to glow, each at the center of her own ring of men. Tawe's servants wore white aprons and carried trays of champagne. They had long limbs and long, narrow noses, unmarked by piercings or scarring. They were, she guessed, a non-warring people like the Anapa. What would happen if they ever put a governor station down the Uat River? You couldn't tie a white apron on a lambaño. You'd get your neck slit if you tried. She took a glass from a tray held out to her. On the other side of the room, beyond the tray and the arm of the toy man who held it, she saw a man beside the tree, a man quite possibly taller than the tree, touching a branch with his fingers. Without her glasses, my face would have been little more than a pinkish smudge among many, but she seemed to know it was me as soon as I lifted my head. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to take any questions if you have any. Yes?
How did you settle on the title of your book, and what did you hope it would capture in the book? And when in the writing of it did you settle on the title?
That's a great question. It didn't even occur to me that I needed a title when I started this book. I don't know why, but when you're focusing on one thing, you can just forget everything else that is necessary. And I don't even know what I was calling the book, to be honest with you. And then I wrote this line. There's a dialogue that they have as part of their sort of 36 hours of conversation at the beginning of the book, and she asks him what's his favorite part of all this anthropological work, and he's like, well, he's having such a difficult time, really struggling with his work when he meets them, and he's like, what is yours? And she says that it's 8 weeks in, when there's sort of the illusion that she knows, she understands the tribe, like everything kind of clicks into place, and she thinks she knows exactly what she's going to write, and she says it's a complete delusion, but it's the briefest, purest euphoria. So I wrote that line, I wrote that word euphoria, and I think it must have been like this, and I was like, maybe that's the title. And so I think I called the files Euphoria after that. And then sometime during this process, my editor asked me what the title of my book was, and I said Euphoria, and she said, oh, we'll have to change that. And then the exact same thing with my agent. She asked me, she's like, oh yeah, we got to come up with something new. That's a terrible title. And then we never could figure out a different title. I don't exactly know what was running through my head when I thought that's a good title. I think probably it was I need something for this file when I'm putting it on the computer and I don't have anything to call it. I was looking for something, but I don't really remember, but I know that, and this is so true for really much everything I do, I don't necessarily know the meaning until I'm done with the first draft. And then I kind of slowly figure out what I'm trying to say. But I never have the intellectual ideas or the themes or even something like this, like a conceit or an extended metaphor or something that's supposed to reverberate throughout. I don't really work like that. I would feel paralyzed if I tried to apply my English teacher brain on a first draft. I often say it's kind of, I just feel like I'm a worm on the ground. I'm just feeling and sensing and not really doing a lot of intellectualizing of the process. I'm just trying to hear how it would be, and so that came out of one of those moments where I just heard that line of dialogue, but now I think it very much works. As with Bateson, he's the narrator of the story, and he's telling it from much further in the future, and he's looking back, and really this was his briefest, purest moment of euphoria, and so I think it works in that way, as well as a lot of other ways. I have a lot of people who come up to me and say, well, I think it's called euphoria because of this, and I'm like, ooh, that's good. So I think there are a lot of ways to see it. Any other questions? Yes.
You do such an extraordinary job of creating or giving a sense of the experience of field work, which God knows is not a common experience. And I've been wondering ever since I read the book last year, how did you sort of privilege? There's so many resources on Gregory and Margaret in particular. How did you privilege certain documents over others?
The great thing is that I was only interested in this 4-month period, so I didn't have to look. Obviously I had to have a background, in their lives and what they might have experienced. But it was interesting. I didn't feel like there was very much. I really didn't, especially about sort of biographically. I could read the books that they wrote about this time, and I could read their other books. But it was hard to find real details. There are some letters that she wrote. I mean, there's a thing called Letters in the Field that was published, in the 70s. It's useless for me. I mean, it's all of her letters to colleagues, and it feels, it's not about her personal life at all, and you feel like she's really glossing over a lot of things. Sorry, hot flash. And then I did stumble on these letters to Ruth Benedict, who was her colleague, lover, dear friend, and to her, she really wrote the truth. And that wasn't published until 2000 and something. And I actually didn't find it. For whatever reason, I didn't know about it until deep into the process of this book. And once I had that, I mean, that was very, very useful to kind of understand. But by then I'd kind of already written a lot of the book anyway, but I was able to pillage some of those little details from that letter. But a lot I really couldn't, because my book had gone in a different direction. And then, I mean, there's a lot to read about anthropology, and I obviously had never done any field work at all, and it was really guesswork. I mean, I don't know. I think there's a part of me that would have loved to have done that kind of work, and so I think I poured maybe some of my own ideas of what that would like and what that would be like and why I would like it into the book. Thank you for your question. Yes.
Did you make up the names of the tribes, or did you made them up?
I did.
Wondering, technically, when you're writing a book that's grounded in reality like that, how it works in terms of how accurate you are.
I have to say that there are no rules for any of this, and I really didn't know what I was doing. And I didn't have any models. I didn't really know where to turn for how I should do this. But I guess my feeling was, I did read about those tribes that she studied, the Arapesh, the Mundagamor, and the Chambuli. Or now they're called the Chambri, but she called them the Chambuli. And I read, everything she wrote about them, and then I read what other researchers since then have written about those tribes. But I didn't feel like I wanted to be responsible for depicting them accurately, because I knew, anybody. Yeah, and then I just read a lot of field work about a lot of different tribes all over the world, and so I just kind of picked and chose what I liked about, what I thought was interesting, and so that's how I kind of came up with them. I made up all of the tribal names, the languages, and some of the customs are real. Sometimes I just needed to make up my own custom, my own taboo, however I just gave myself, after a while, free license reign to do whatever I wanted, thinking, really, I have to be honest with you, thinking the whole time, I will never publish this book. This is an absurd idea. It's absurd for me to try to do this. And so I just went for it, because I really didn't think it would ever see the light of day. So that's part of it. Yeah.
I have another process question. You write in the notebook, so you obviously had quite a few notebooks, and then do you transcribe it to the computer, or do you give it to your editor?
Yeah, I meant to discuss that a little bit, because that's really my most important step, is going from the handwritten to the computer, and it really depends what I'm feeling like. Sometimes I can write a whole notebook and not put any of it on the computer. Other times I can feel like I need to reconnect with this material. I can't remember where I'm going, and I need to start, typing it all in. I need to see it, more laid out. And so it kind of depends when I do it, but it's a really important step for me. I completely do it myself, because I'm rewriting every single word, and every single word I kind of hold up. It's like I can bring the judge back in the room after I've banished that sort of editor or judge self, because you can't be judging when you're doing the blank page writing, you can't really be saying that sucks, that's terrible. You know, I kind of have to get that out and just like let myself go, and then I can bring the judge in and say, okay, this is good, this is bad, this is what we need, you know. And then I sort of, it always feels very schizophrenic, but I kind of work with myself, and you know, the creator and the judge kind of work together to put it on the computer in a way that I can live with, and that's a really important step for me. Thank you for asking. Any other questions? Yes?
You just mentioned that you you wrote this without ever expecting it to see the light of day. But obviously it saw the light of day. How did that happen?
Well, I just kept writing draft after draft, and eventually I gave it to my husband. We were actually going to see his father in Florida, I believe, and so I gave him a draft, and he read it on the plane, and or at least he began it on the plane anyway. And he was sitting, my kids and I were sitting in one part, and he got a seat farther away, and so he took the farther away seat, and so we had to change in, I think, Baltimore. And we get off the plane, and he's waiting right there, and I get off with the kids, and I'm like, oh God, you know, what is he gonna think? He said, nobody has read a word of this, I'm terrified. And he just looks at me, he's like, riveting. Oh, it was just made me so happy. It was like, we're honestly the happiest moment of my whole, you know, career was when he said that. And so, you know, and then he read it for the next, actually we're visiting my mom in California. He read it for the next few days, and was just really, really encouraging. And so that gave me the confidence to do some tinkering with, you know, suggestions he made, and then show it to my writers group and to my sister, who's right there in the back, wearing the sunglasses, like the movie star. And my sister was really, really enthusiastic about it too, and so that really, really made me feel so much better. So, you know, and then my writers group was great, and you know, they're hard. I mean, they're harder to please than my editor and my agent combined. To be honest with you, they're an excellent group of women, and they're sharp, and they don't let me get away with anything. And so we had a really great conversation about the book, and I just took frantic notes, and I tape recorded it, and then I wrote a draft. I showed it to my agent. I wrote another draft, and then finally I gave it to my editor, and so, you know, it was a slow feeling like, you know, I think this is gonna happen, but I didn't. I really, when you hand in something that you've shown no one, it really is. It's kind of a terrifying moment.
At any point, did you give it to an anthropologist to sort of validate the anthropology part?
I did. I dragged my feet on that because I was so ashamed and embarrassed of how little I knew and how bad it was going to sound, and you know what she was going to think. So I have a good friend, Liza Bakewell in Maine. She teaches at Brown, and I kept on saying I was going to give it to her, and then I just never would. And then I felt like, oh, she's so busy. She has twins, you know, she can't read this. So then I wouldn't do it. And then it was in galleys. You know, galleys are the little paperback sort of cheapo thing that they make for all the reviewers and everything. Then it was in that, and I realized, I got a month until pub date. I gotta, you know, until they start printing this thing, I gotta give it to her. And I needed it really fast, and so, you know, I offered to pay her, because I felt like it was so unfair, and I needed it to be a job, and I needed her to, you know, take it seriously. And it was so great. I mean, she was really helpful. She prevented me from making huge mistakes, but she also was really crazy about the book. Oh, I was so surprised. All she wanted to talk about was the things that she loved. And I was like, just tell me the mistakes. So we had like a 5-hour conversation. And she was so excited. I mean, she gave me a lot of confidence too. And I think as an anthropologist, you know, I think she was excited to see it, you know, her work in fiction. And I was so surprised that, you know, there were a lot of times she was like, it's exactly like that. That's exactly right. And that was such a relief, I still can hardly believe that she felt that way. But yeah, so that's what I did, but at the very, very last minute. And I wish I had more confidence and called up more people, and you know, there were a lot of people I wanted to talk to or write emails to, but I just had a lot of shame, and I just felt like, when you're writing something and you have this idea that somebody's going to say over the phone, well, you can't do that. You mustn't do that. You're doing things wrong. And so I was scared that somebody was going to tell me that, and so I just sort of stayed silent. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. How much research did you have to do about the culture of that time? The men versus the women. Their kind of how they thought. What their with the sex scene, and that was kind of like brutal. I mean,
yeah.
You didn't read it all. So I mean, just she's all banged up, and he was like, "That's what you want." It's like,
yeah. It was very interesting to go back to that time and imagine how it was, and Mead herself wrote a lot about that. I mean, she was right at the beginning, and she was part of the. She's very, very much part of the women's movement in the 20th century, and yeah, I can't say that I did a lot of specific research about that, but I did read a lot of what she had to say about men and women and what her feelings would have been, and really that time, that 4-month period, it was a lot about trying to figure out. How to break free of these cultural assumptions, about men and women. And I was so interested in writing that, and yet at the same time, I think those kinds of ideas, especially political ideas in a novel, you have to tread very carefully, and you really have to trust the reader to draw. I hate being hit over the head with that sort of stuff, and so. Just a little bit goes a long way. So I felt like I was always treading a line there. Yes?
Can you say a little more about your writers group? Did it precede you as a published writer, and do you still meet with them? And how does that fit into your life as a writer?
Yeah, I'd love to. So when I moved to Maine in 2002, I guess I'd written one novel, and I was working on another one, and I think somewhere in 2004 I realized I really wanted to have a writers group, and by then I had met some other writers, and so I just asked 5 other women who were writers or who I knew loved to write and read, if they wanted to join, and they all did, and we started. So I think it's been going on now for about 11 and a half years. I didn't hand them my second novel because we were just sort of forming it then, and I felt like, oh, let's have a writer's group, and here's my novel. I didn't really want to do that to them. But for all the next one, I certainly did, and all of them, I think everyone has written, a number of books since then. And some have been published and some have not. And we just try to really, really support each other and give each other really good feedback about our writing. And we try to meet every month. It doesn't always happen. Scheduling is really hard. We're all mothers, and with a lot of us have husbands who travel, or we travel, and it's always a little tricky to schedule. But when we get there, it's really great. And we usually. We have something called airings in our writers group, which is when we're not on sometimes we have a manuscript and we've had 8 weeks and we've all read it, and then we meet and we discuss it, for a very long time. When nobody has a manuscript that we're reading, then we sometimes somebody has an essay or a short story, but sometimes we just have airings, and airings are kind of my favorite thing, which is, it's just a few pages and it's first draft stuff. You don't want any feedback yet, but you just want to air your work. And so we air it, and all you're allowed to say is, that was really nice. And no criticism or anything. So it was really, that's my favorite. And it's really funny. Sometimes I stumble when I'm at readings and I read something from one of my books, and I'm like, oh, I aired that. Like, that was the very first time anyone ever heard that. It's really, it's great. They're just really great women. So I'm really lucky to have them. Any other questions? Yes.
Can you talk about it being made into a movie, and are you going to be involved in the screenwriting? Or how does it feel if you're not?
Yeah, so Usually I don't really have much to say about that question because nothing's happened, but now something's happened. And last weekend I got the screenplay. I didn't write it. I didn't want to write it. They got a great screenwriter to write it, and I think it's fantastic. I was really blown away by it because you can imagine, I mean, even though it's not a very long book, to condense it down to 2 hours is really, really a challenge, and I think he has done it absolutely brilliantly. In fact, all of my favorite moments are all things that he made up. I'm like, God, give me more of that. Like, it just felt like really cool, fresh material, and yet he understood. I mean, really, by the 8th page, I was like, oh, he's got it. You know, I am just blown away by it, and so excited. And so, you know, you were mentioning that you're going to show The Theory of Everything. They're really, really hoping to get Eddie Redmayne, who, you know, is the star of that movie, to be Bankson. And, you know, we're sort of batting around other ideas, but they've been very, very inclusive. You know, they showed me the script. I just handed in a bunch of notes about the script, and I'm kind of checking my email a lot because I don't know how they're going to respond to my notes. I loved it. I told them that a million times, and I just kind of went through and little things, you know, that I thought maybe weren't as realistic, or just tiny things, you know, really. Nothing huge. And so I'm sort of waiting to hear, you know, if that was a welcome thing or if I really pissed them off. I kept on saying, you know, I don't know this process. I only know, you know, how to respond as a writer. And, you know, if I am overstepping, please let me know. I love them and trust them already. So it's Michael Apted is the director and Paige Simpson is the producer. And I don't know. I've never really, it's not ever been a huge fantasy of mine to have a movie made out of a book of mine. The fantasy for me is having the book made out of a book. And I'm happy to have, you know, the movie, and it's kind of, you know, exciting to see what might happen, so thanks. Did you have a question? Okay.
No, I was going to ask the same thing.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, well, thank you all so much. I appreciate it.
Start with just 2 little things. When I first heard about this idea for doing a documentary, I was very dubious. I couldn't figure out how they would do it, or why they would do it, or what would come of it. And they said, well, let's come and talk to you. Well, they came on a day when I had a very bad flu, and they talked to me for about 15 minutes at a time, at which time my voice would disappear. And they'd go talk to Jean, my daughter, and my granddaughter, who appear in it, and of course made me a hero because I got them in the movies. But I thought, in seeing it, and I've seen it many times now, I'm amazed at how well they caught the spirit of the book and with what feeling they caught it, especially in that comparison of the relation of children and their delight in certain things and the way adults receive it in a somewhat different way. I thought it was a beautiful job, and interesting, the young woman who did it, Hannah Jayanti, is Indian, so not from this culture. Her father is a very distinguished documentary filmmaker in England, and he came over and helped a bit. And everybody who worked on it just seemed to plug in exactly the right way, so I was delighted. I hope you enjoyed it. So.
Fabulous.
Yeah. I wanted to start with just expanding a little bit on something that happened in the film, where I talked about this little boy who was concerned and asked me a question when I was talking to his class about learning. He had the same doubts and misunderstandings and dubiousness about learning, why we learn, how we learn, why is it necessary to do that. And if you think back, of course, children, about when they start at just being born, about the age of 5 or more, when they begin to read with some regularity, get all their feelings about life, not only the information, but the way things really mean, non-verbally almost. They get it, they don't read, they don't get things explained, they experience. They hang on, they crawl around the floor, they find things, they go outside, they get bitten by a bug. Millions of things happen which makes them begin to understand life. Not that they understand everything, but they become part of it. Anyway, he got up, I had talked, and the kids had asked a lot of questions. And most of the time, those questions had been directed by teachers. So they had to do it, they did a question, they gave it to the teacher, she changed it for them, they came back, they asked me, and I could always tell when that process had taken place, because when he finished, or he or she finished asking the question, they immediately turned off. And they didn't care about the answer, because they had done what they were supposed to do. They had performed for the teacher. It was really her question. But he was mystified, as I have been for a good part of my life, on why we have all these bits and pieces of information and why they're so important. And that's when I began to operate on this thing where I had this image of things, that completely isolated kinds of things in the world. And I explained, as I said here, as best I could, about the connections being that important. And in my own mind, as was said in there, it was the connections that made the difference. It was what gave meaning and a sense of importance to them. Anyway, and I to me, that was the sum of life. You didn't search for the factual information. You searched for the things that gave real meaning to things. Anyway, when I finished, he looked at me very quietly and said, "Then what happens?" And I was absolutely bewildered. And I shouldn't have said this, but the first thing that popped into my mind, I said, "And then you die." And I knew immediately the way I phrased it was exactly wrong. But what I meant was that was the real sum of your life, were those meaningful things that you found and discovered that gave meaning or validity or whatever term you want to attach to it. And there were a lot of very troubled looks I got, including teachers. And it was amazing to me. And I learned another lesson from that, from those sessions that I had with kids. That I'm trying to find a way to say this. That I taught for 32 years, always as an adjunct. I always had other things, my architecture, my writing. And I discovered years later that what I taught or thought I was teaching at any given time was not what they were learning at any given time. And sometimes hours later, sometimes a week later, sometimes months later, someone would come up or call me or write me a note and say, "You know what you're talking about? I think I'm beginning to understand that." And that's the real process of learning. You don't plant a seed and expect an immediate response with a blossom. It takes a long time, and it takes the other experiences in your life to integrate all those things. And it's a lesson I think, sadly, we haven't learned well enough yet in teaching. So I just want to go through that. It made more of an impression on me than I've ever experienced before. That was the real, at least for me, the answer.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I am really, really excited to be here today, as I'm sure you guys are too. And I'm hoping that Norton and I can have a fun conversation. I'm a fan as well as a writer, and I have lots of questions. I kind of, in my own head, to sort of organize today, I wanted to ask some questions that came out of the documentary for me, and then some questions about the toll booth, and then if we have time, a few more questions, and get some questions from you guys. Steve, what's our time frame, so I can keep an eye on the clock?
As long as it's reasonable.
All right. Hope you're free today. I really enjoyed seeing the process in the documentary about how you wrote Toll Booth, going up and down the stairs and handing off pages to Jules to illustrate. And writing most of the time is really solitary, and we have no contact with our illustrators. And I wonder how that collaboration of being able to share your words and see his pictures maybe inspired you or helped you along with the story.
Well, first of all, your characterization of a writing is only half right. It is solitary. The other part of it is it's very scary. You wake up in the morning and go out and look at that pad sitting on the table or on the desk, and you say to yourself, I don't have anything in my head. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm never going to be able to do it. And it's constant. It's always there. I always tell people there are 3 steps to writing, 2 of which I adore. One of which is the anticipation of writing, where you know you're going to do something wonderful, where you sit down and start out writing your Nobel Prize speech. You know you're going to make a lot of money, you're going to become very famous, all those things. That's very heady stuff that you like. And the third step, of course, is having finished, which is a wonderful experience. It's done, and you have won in a sense, not that you may have produced a masterpiece, but with all of the things that stand in the way and with all of the frightening things, you've finished it. You've done it, and you've finished it. Whatever happens to it, that's your triumph. You've done it. And it makes for extraordinary anxiety and unhappiness and every kind of scariness you can possibly think of. And yet, months, sometimes years later, you think back, and that's such an intense, happy period of your life because you've committed yourself so completely to something that has been your life for a period of time. And the fact that you finished it becomes, again, even more of a triumph. So I just wanted to say, I have friends who write in very different ways. Everybody writes in very different ways, I think. Some of them, I know, would come home from work in New York. I have a friend who worked in the office, came home, would write over a lunch hour and then get back. And I can't get up unless I have the day ahead of me that's completely blank and nobody's around to talk to me. I even, at times, you saw the cat always liked to be in there. Sometimes I'd have to throw the cat out of the room because he was disturbing. Not saying anything, not as a critic, but just that pitter-patter sometimes of feet across the room, would bother me. So it's a very complex thing. Now get me back to where you want me.
How was it to be able to then hand off your words to Jules and see them come to life in the illustrations right there when you were working on it?
Well, I never knew what I was going to get from Jules. And I learned one thing very quickly. You don't tell an illustrator about your illustrations or what you want or what you think. You can talk about the story, but it's his or her image or extension, really. That's what it is. They're not there to illustrate your words. They're there to make an additional meaning or world available for the story. So it all becomes one entity. Of course, Jules is marvelous. He's so talented. We had some troubles in the beginning because there are lots of things Jules didn't like to do. One, he would always say, "I hate backgrounds." To him, backgrounds is anything but a human face. And so he didn't like to do that. But there were times when he'd come to me like, he would say, there was one scene in which the armies of wisdom go to rescue Rhyme and Reason, and they were mounted on horses. He did not like to do horses. He claimed he couldn't do them. So he came to me one day and said, "Would it be all right if you mounted the army on cats?" I said, "No, I didn't think that was such a..." So what he did was he drew 3 little silhouettes of horses, or 4 actually, and then just put people on them. So it ended up, I think we had 5 people on 4 horses. Nobody ever noticed locally. But the big thing, when I was a kid, I read an enormous number of books, and the ones I loved most had maps on the end papers. When you open the cover, there was an English writer named Arthur Ransom, who I love, who always had a map of what was going on. So when I did the book, I said, "I'm going to have a map in this book." I know, and so I asked him about, I don't draw maps. Well, if you've ever driven with Jules, you know what his attitude towards maps is. You never seem to get anywhere. Anyway, I sat down and I drew the map. Maps are a great hobby of mine. And gave it to him, and he put a piece of paper on it and traced it so it would be his line, his sense of the picture. And it worked out beautifully, and what really ticked me off was that every time we go anywhere, people compliment him on his map. And he takes all that praise and never mentions.
We can set the record straight today.
It got to the point, finally, where I would start doing things just to tick him off, that I knew he would have difficulty doing, and he would try to subvert me. And it got just very, very strange. I made up for him near the end when they go fight past the demons. One group of demons I invented purely for him. were the triple demons of compromise. One short and fat, one tall and thin, and the third exactly like the other two. Try drawing them. But he got his revenge, of course, as was said. I became what is it? Weatherman, yes. Which is a complete mistake. Of course, I never wore a toga, so everything else was okay, but the toga was not so good. But in general, though, we had, it all turned out to being a very good time. We were always at each other. He was right when he said that we just looked for that moment where you could go to the throat, you know, and get it. But it was all in fun, so. But the interesting thing about writing the book, which made it so interesting, was I don't write sequentially, right? I find that in most places. I just do a lot of notes and a lot of bits and pieces. And quite often when I'm thinking about characters and I don't know them yet, I'll sit there for a day and write conversations between some of the characters I know will hook up in the book that never get used in the book. They're just my way of getting to know, you know, these people. And they were helpful to him because he was looking at the same time for a way to characterize, not literally, but someone once very accurately described Jules as the only artist they knew who could draw an idea. And I think was exactly right. He could do that. So we had a very good time doing it. But editors and publishers can drive you nuts because she was right. It was not something that they liked. In fact, if you come to a publisher with a story with your own illustrations, they'll throw you out of the office.
They don't want
Yeah.
it. They like to match you up on their own terms.
Yeah. I've been very lucky though, because that started me out. So since that time, I've always had a say.
That's great. Do you and Jules still see one another very often, or?
We talk more than we see each other. He lives all the way out on Long Island now, and I'm of course up here in Amherst. But we do, yeah, we stay in touch.
And you got to work on the Odious Ogre together.
Oh, that's 50 years apart, you know, between that and the Toldos. But he loved doing it because he always wanted to do an ogre. And I don't know whether you remember, but in the beginning of the book, what he absolutely loved most was not being able to get that whole ogre on the page. So all you saw were pieces of him until you got very far into the book, and he loved that.
Was that a different process working on that book?
A little bit, because we weren't that close together, but we talked a lot. But the thing you can never do, even if you get assigned an illustrator, you cannot sit down and say, this is what you want in the pictures. The first one I did with another illustrator was really an eye-opener to me, because I found that there were times when I had, say, 2 or 3 pages of text, and the illustrator would come in with a few pictures, and I'd say, my God, these pictures are so good, I don't need that text. Nobody eliminates my words. But you did, we had to do it, and it worked better, because he could embody in those pictures better than I could write about it.
And that's how you know you have a good author-illustrator marriage, right? That's how you make it a really compelling
I did
book.
several books with a man named Chris Rashka. I don't know if any of you know any of his. He's done a lot of children's books.
A Ball for Daisy is one
Well,
of his.
I did a book with him, which he won a Caldecott for, called The Hello Goodbye Window, which was about my granddaughter. And it was such a wonderful experience.
They have copies of it out there if you want to take a look at it later. I'm also curious about something that Eric Carle said in the documentary. He said, when you go to sit down to write, you're not writing for anybody but yourself. And he kind of said that he was putting words in your mouth, and so I wanted to give you a chance to answer.
He's exactly right. In fact, I have, I made several lists about the questions people ask me, and one of them is writing for an audience, which you can't do, I don't think, because you never know what that audience is really going to be. You write for yourself, and you try to embody a certain measure of truth or feeling, whatever you want to attribute to it. And they either have to get it their own way or not. Whatever you understand, and that thing, and it said it very well in the documentary. When you read something, it is what you think it is. It is not what some teacher or some parent or somebody else thinks it ought to be, or it should be, or that's the way we teach it. And you can't write by saying, I'm going to do a lesson, about this. I did another book, it was a third book I did called Alberic the Wise, which never really did very well, but I liked it. I thought it was one of the best things I'd ever written. But it were 3 longest short stories set in medieval times. And I decided to take 3 ideas, which are very commonplace idea. What's wisdom, what's reality, and what's happiness? And I set it in a long lost time in a way that was backwards to what you would ordinarily think about it. And it was such a pleasure to write because it opened up a whole world to me. So, that's what you can't write for an audience. It's the best way to fall on your face.
And what ends up happening when you write for yourself is then you end up telling a story that you find compelling, and then other people connect through that, right?
And they connect in such different ways. I'll get a letter from someone, and they'll either congratulate me or talk with great feeling about this thing I put in the book. I didn't put it there, not consciously anyway.
So it's something that they found.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? That's
for themselves.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that pleases you no end, because it means there's stuff hidden that you're not even aware of yet.
That other people find and make their own, right? That's how we develop those connections with literature and stories.
I read. We had a very strange assortment of books when I was a child, and my parents had a whole shelf of nothing but monstrously long Russian and Yiddish novels. We wrote 1,500 pages of stuff. And I would read them cover to cover, have no understanding of what it is that they were about. But I loved the language, and every once in a while an idea would pop through, probably 80% my sense of what they were trying to do. But it meant something, to me.
That was you.
And
right?
it was a totally different reading experience than most people seem to come to on their own. So I pick up a book, I read it, and I take it literally. It's like poetry. I read a lot of poetry. I would say at least 80% or more of the poetry I read, I don't understand literally. I mean, I don't understand what they're talking about. But the language and the sound, the music of it is so beautiful. I'll read it and I'll enjoy it. And maybe sometime later, something will dawn on me. Oh, yes.
Kind of like what you were saying with the students, right? It's down
Yeah,
the road,
yes.
right? The poetry kind of plants a seed for you to think about. And
We tend, I think sadly, not to value that as part of an educational methodology, to let people do that. So,
to let them think.
Yeah.
Give them some time. Have you reread The Phantom Toll?
A couple of times, yeah, and I'm always appalled at all the things I think are wrong. The nicest thing I get, though, from people is, I know all authors get letters. I loved your story, I like this, I like that. But the thing that I get a lot, which gives me the most pleasure, is someone saying, and I think Jules brought it up in there, how it's changed their life, or how they now think about things in a different way. And that is the best thing that has ever happened. Right.
That's such a gift. Is there, aside maybe from Milo, is there a character in the novel that is your kind of favorite, or that you had a lot of fun with, or get a lot of mail about?
Well, of course, you're right. Milo is very much me, and in some way, not in every way. I wasn't a total malcontent, and I wasn't a psychotic kid. I was just very much, I don't know how you can say, offended by going to school and not being allowed to do or to learn things the way I thought I should be learning. And so I was a discontent, you might say. I think probably my mother spent more time in elementary school than I did. She was always being called to the principal's office. Let's see. Get me back again.
Other characters.
Yeah. Well, some of the characters came in odd ways. I had Milo, and I said to myself, he needs a mentor. Every kid needs someone they respect to the degree that makes a difference. And all I could think of was, when I was in elementary school, I left at 3, I came home, there was a string of 15-minute little adventure programs for kids. And one of them was Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy. And Jack Armstrong had an Uncle Jim. I don't know if any of you remember this or have heard of it. But Jim was his mentor. He was trustworthy. He was always looking out for Jack Armstrong's welfare. He was always there. He could steer him, you know, in right directions. He said, that's what we need. But I don't want Uncle Jim. But I found there's a dog, and I knew it was a watchdog, so that, of course, gave birth to that huge clock in his belly. And it worked. I liked it, but then I said to myself, no, it's not enough. Because you can't have this wonderful mentor who always tells them what's good. There's always the other side of the coin. That the riffraff who's going to do whatever, who can't be trusted, who doesn't tell the truth, who doesn't give a damn about the
And wants
character.
to take all the credit.
Yeah, all of that stuff. And that became the humbug. So, and it just began to build that way. And these were not things that were happening sequentially.
As you were going,
Yeah.
the pieces kind of fell into place.
And they're all parts of people that you know. I think there are parts of me in every character in some way. But the hardest thing when you're trying to deal with a character is not arrive at a situation where that character is only alive when he's on stage or on the page. You've got to have a sense of that character, that there's a life that is continuous from before and after. And a certain character will do some things, but won't do other things. And you can get yourself in a position, which I've done and had to change things, where you're at a certain point and you want something to happen, but the character who's supposed to make it happen would not do that.
You have to stay true to them.
Yeah, and you have to cut back and go all the way back and find a way to do it differently.
That's a lot of revision.
Yeah.
In writing.
In the Hello Goodbye window with my granddaughter, she's the protagonist really in the whole thing. And I began writing it, and I wrote for about a week or two. And I said to myself one day, it's very nice writing, but you know something? It's not Tori. It's not her voice. It's not her way of thinking about things. Chucked the whole thing, went back, and tried to put myself, you know, into her skin. It was very hard work, but I think it worked. It began to work, and I was, you know, very pleased, and I delighted most in the fact that I caught it, and I got rid of it.
Are there times when maybe you don't catch it and your editor is the one who points that out?
There are editors and editors. There are very few, what I call really good editors. One of them you saw, Jason Epstein. Another one I worked with recently. But usually what a editor will tell you is, this doesn't work, and this is what you have to do. And outside of when you get over being offended by who is he to tell me what to do, or she, you realize that it's not the way it works. And with Jason and with a few others, we'll have a discussion, and they'll set what they think, and they'll set it in a way of, this is a problem, maybe, or this is something that you want to think about. And you'll come back, and you'll go back and forth and back and forth. You'll go home, you'll come back in whatever it is, a week, 2 weeks, or what have you. And I remember being told once, I said, this editor said to me, you know, I lay out what I think is a problem, and you argue what you think the problem is. You go away and you come back with something that's entirely different from both of those arguments. And that's a good process. That means you're thinking back into it. I'm an addicted revisionist. I love revising things for many, many reasons. One of them is, when I read like those difficult books, I was told as a kid reading my parents' long Russian novels, which were translated, by the way, thank goodness. I had a very, very difficult time with them, and I'm losing my thread now. You'll have to forgive me. Sometimes that happens.
The revisionist.
Yes. But the thing, if you're reading a difficult book, a book that's difficult, say, for a child of any age, or even an adult sometimes, you will keep going in your reading if what you're having difficulty with doesn't stop the flow of the book, the sense that you're in the story, and you can go by it and come back later. It doesn't destroy the continuity of it. And so I'm always looking for things like that, and sometimes it's no more than the rhythm of a book. You might change, take a word out, change a syllable, something, so that the flow in the reading, you can go past and come back later.
And carry
Yeah.
it along. I think that's something that, today, if the Phantom Tollbooth were being submitted, I think a lot of editors would say, oh, this is too complicated
Yeah.
for kids, and it's too wordy, as we saw up on.
They did.
Yeah. And, do you think that we don't give our readers, that editors might not give our readers enough credit,
I
like
think,
you said?
I think that's completely true, yeah, you're right. They're used to what has sold, they're used to what has become popular, or become established in some way. And that's what they want. If you try something different, and I wasn't trying to do anything different, I was just trying to write what I had on my mind. I mean, it wasn't a conscious effort to say I'm gonna remake the children's book field. I wouldn't have known how to do that anyway. But you are constantly amazed, I know I am. I have, my granddaughter now is just going into college in September. She's 18, she's gonna be 19 soon. One of the things I've learned as a parent is at that certain age, you almost have to retool when you're talking to them. You can't get by with the same kind of things you perhaps did when they were 10 years younger or something. And I'm amazed sometimes at the level of her reasoning or understanding about something. And that has to be thought of, I think, when you're writing. Look, you're writing a book which will primarily be for children. But I don't believe in the idea that there is a children's book that shouldn't be not only applicable but desirable to read for an adult. Because I think I said that somewhere in the movie. I think that you carry that along. If you don't take that with you into adulthood, you're in big trouble, I think.
And I think one of the great things about a book like The Phantom Tollbooth is you can keep going back to it and get new things from it every time you read it, no matter how old you are or when the last time was that you read it. There's so much there for every age. It's a book that grows with you, which is, I think, one of the reasons why it's, still in print 50 years later and why we still love it so much. It really is, it's lovely and delightful in that way. I'm also kind of wondering, about the fact that that book has lasted so long, and we like to say, oh, the world has changed so much. There's so much more technology that competes for kids' time, and video games and smartphones, and do you see a difference in kids and the readers from the 60s and 70s through today, the way that they maybe connect with the book?
Well, I see a lot of differences. I don't think I see what you're referring to, which are the really important differences. Yeah, the hardware is very different. And there are many other influences, but I especially see, I get a lot of mail from kids, and I especially, over the years, I see that some things don't change. Kids at a certain age are worried about the same things. They're frightened about the same things. They're unsure about some things they don't understand. And those are fairly universal at early ages. It's not so much they want answers. They want someone to understand that those are issues that are important. Yeah.
So maybe the window dressing changes, but
Yeah.
The reader doesn't, right? What's on the outside. Most recently, you've been publishing picture books. Are you going to write any more novels? Are you working on any novels?
I don't know. I never know what I'm going to do. They refer to it in the film too, that my impetus for getting into the children's book was to avoid doing what I didn't want to do, and I find that's been my main way of working my whole life. I'll get myself into something I think is a good idea, and at a certain point go, uh-oh. and I'll start on something else. I haven't written in a while. I've had some problems with a knee and a shoulder, which I broke, and a whole bunch of other things. So, and but I hope to be getting back. And I don't know. I have some children's book things. I want to be doing something related to what we're talking about now. I think that would be
That'd be great.
It'll just let me vent a lot of things.
Did you ever end up writing that book that you were supposed to write when you started reading Phantom Tollbooth?
You had to ask that. Oh. But there is that one thing in the Phantom Tollbooth that I took directly from the research on that, and that was those two cities of reality and illusions. That's fairly early in the book, of people who live in a place and don't see it. And which is the way we live in many ways in the places we live, in cities and towns and things. Mostly in cities, I think.
Well, I think we're better off for having the Phantom Tollbooth than the architecture.
Well, I don't know. What got me interested in doing the book on what I call urban perception, the way people live in cities, the way they see them, the way they change, and the way it affects their lives, are still issues that are very important today. I hope someone does one someday.
Just for fun, I see in some of your biographies you say that you're an amateur chef and professional eater.
Yes.
I'm wondering what you like to cook and what is your favorite meal?
Wow. One of my problems is, of course, I like to eat almost anything. But when I cook, there are things I like to do. I love making sort of oddball dishes. I'm a catch-as-can cook. I don't follow recipes a lot. I mean, I'll use sometimes to get a general idea, but so I do. I'll make all kinds of oddball things. It's hard to describe. And my wife is here, and she's gotten to be a good cook. So between us, we do okay. I think okay. Although she doesn't like to plan meals, she'd much rather have someone come in and lay out what to do.
That sounds good to me.
Yeah.
Should we open it up for some questions
Oh,
from
by
the
all
audience?
means.
Sure. So does anybody have a question?
You said the 3 steps of writing, anticipation and being finished, but you never talked about the middle.
About what?
The middle step.
Oh, I thought I had. I'm sorry. That's always torture for me. Because I'm so unsure and so anxiety-ridden, by it. And it takes me an age, and I write, and I'll take a whole day's work at the end of the day and crumple it up and throw it out. And it happens very slowly, and as I said, I revise and revise and revise, and of course the great secret of revising is when you do 20 revisions, it should sound like you just wrote it for the first time. Otherwise, there's a great danger of sucking all the life out of something by over, revising, and all those issues haunt you. And it seems like the most miserable time of your life, but as I think I mentioned that in later years, it becomes one of the things you remember as one of the great pleasures. I don't know how that works. It's goofy to think. But that is one of the pleasures of your life, that you did it and you survived it.
Crumple or delete?
What?
You said you crumple it and throw it. Do
Yeah.
you delete and throw? It's on paper?
Do you write on paper? Or?
I always try to put things on paper, and I make millions of notes. And having been brought up, my basic education was not so much verbal as it was in pictures. I went to architectural school. When I was a kid, my father was an architect, so everything I played with were bits and pieces from his office. My brother also became an architect, and I draw always, with him, or he would look at the stuff I drew, and it was a great relationship. And so the verbal part was less important, luckily, because I think that's one of the advantages I had. That I think we are, at least in our educational system, there's such a verbal bias that the things that are very important, what gives you the opportunity to look at things from other points of view, other things that whenever we have a budget conflict disappear. music, dance, artwork, sculpture, you name it, all the things that are visual. And when I taught architecture, the hardest thing to do was to get kids to understand that there was more than one way to look at something. When they got an idea, at least initially, they were always convinced that that was going to be the last idea they ever got. And so they held on to it with a death grip. And so most of our critique sessions were always, why don't we go around the other way and try to come at this from a different direction, which they resented, at least in the beginning, very much. And after a while, they sort of grow into thinking that might have some value to it. And I think when you can bring other things than just the verbal to it, you increase your sense of understanding, or even your enthusiasm when you begin to discover that. So I hope it begins to answer some of that.
Well, that's the thinking part.
Yeah.
You're letting, again, teaching them to think.
Yeah, and that's not an easy thing to do. The one great difficulty with a nonverbal subject, of course, is you are left naked and exposed in the classroom when you have to put that thing up there, and the whole class is standing there looking at it. And the hardest thing to do was get the kids to crit the other kids when you had something up, because they didn't want to say anything bad about a friend of theirs that was there. And by the end of the year, they would hack each other in a good way. You make someone see, because whether you're writing or whether you're doing a piece of architecture or whatever it is, you want to get that sense that you are the best critic you have is yourself, and you have to develop that bloodthirsty aptitude for not being afraid to go after yourself on something.
And that's how you grow as an artist.
Yeah,
or
I think so,
architect or a writer. Do we have another question? Oh, in the back.
In your book, Reason says to Milo, when a housefly flaps his wings, a breeze goes around the world. Did you have chaos theory in your mind?
I have what?
Chaos theory.
No, I didn't. Just that we rarely focus on the importance of small things that affect people in many ways you just don't anticipate. It's an overstatement, of course. The flies flapping his wings, that particular thing doesn't perhaps go all around the world, but it goes in sometimes much further or much differently than you anticipate. And that's what I think you have to allow for, that those things will happen.
Another question? Sure.
How did you come up with the name Milo?
That's an interesting story. Everything is an interesting story. Well, I went to school for a year in England, University of Liverpool. And I got to know a lot of people who were in theater, because Liverpool was just across the Irish Sea from Dublin, and Dublin, Ireland, has a great theater tradition. And one of the people I got to know was an actor in the Dublin stage named Milo O'Shea. And I loved the name. I'd never heard it before. Well, anyway, Milo O'Shea came to this country, and for many years was very successful in Hollywood doing what they call character roles. Never really the leads, but very important. And I never met him. After that, after I'd met him once in Dublin, he was very successful, and when I started writing, I needed a name for the first character. And I said, I love that name, Milo. And so I used it, and then I discovered that there was another book that came out the same year, 1961, and one of the major characters was, you got it, a Milo. Milo Minder, who was in, what was it, Joe Heller's book.
Something in the air for the Milos.
Catch-22.
Catch-22.
Yeah.
Do we have another question? Oh, over here in the back in the purple. I can see your arm.
How could you come up with so many crazy characters in the book?
They weren't crazy. Maybe a little bit odd, but they weren't crazy. The characters were all characters who embodied ideas. I don't know, it's a hard thing to explain, but they were, it's very hard to invent a character, so you have to have something in mind, some attitude, or frame of mind, a way of looking at something. And I bet if you think hard enough, you have some people you know, or some friends, who, if you had to describe them, you would characterize them, not so much by the way they look, but some of the kind of little oddball things that they do. And that, and they would just kind of creep in. I'd be thinking one day, and suddenly I'd think of something like that, and I'd make them into a character. And then I'd spend time with them. And as I said, give them conversations with other people so I could get to know them a little bit. And of course, there's always that little bit of me that always snuck into every character.
Like somebody who is protective might be like Tuck,
Yeah.
the watchdog. Do we have another question? Oh, in the back.
It seems like there's a lot of play on idioms, and I was wondering if the book has been translated into other languages.
There's about 35 different foreign language editions of the book now. They're all over the place. Of course, I can't read most. But I'm told that there's a Russian edition that I'm told, because I'm at Amherst, and Amherst College has a very good Russian language department. I know some people there, and they said they did a very good job. What really always puzzled me is, as you know, there's a lot of wordplay in the book. How were they going to translate it into another language? But they seem to do okay. I'm just very grateful that that happens, that it will do that. The whole language thing is very interesting. I mean, you saw in the movie, you know, the thing about my father with who, he was a very gentle, very kind, very thoughtful man with one of those very dry senses of humor, that he'd hit you with something and maybe 2 days later you'd realize you'd been had. And he always, no matter what time he walked into the house, he would have something to say, a pun or something, and which your first reaction is always, oh. And then after a while you say to yourself, I understand that, and I can do that. And then you're hooked.
So do you still enjoy wordplay?
Oh, I absolutely love it. It always sneaks into almost everything I do. The other great influence in my life, of course, I grew up in the 1930s, which when all the great Marx Brothers films were made, and I would take my, 25 cents ticket in the theater, I'd see every one of them, not once, but several times, because you couldn't see one of those films once and really understand everything, because they were insane in many ways, but they also had some wonderful insights into things that,
There's a lot going on in those movies. Yeah, it'd be cool. I saw another hand over here in the corner. Sure.
Do you still have the original sketches and notes
uh,
in the book?
I don't have them, but I have, many years ago, I had boxes and boxes of these things, didn't know what to do with them, and a friend of mine in Amherst, who deals in rare manuscripts and books and things like that, sold them to the Lilly Library at Indiana University. They had, and now a second batch, which I've given him, he's offering to them. That's just about everything I've ever done, but and they had a lot of the notes and everything. It's because one of the things that made them interesting to the Lilly Library was it wasn't just story roughs, it was process that I wasn't trying to set up something, but that's what it was. Of course, I think in that way, so I always, I'll write pages and pages of notes, put them in an envelope, put them away, maybe a month later, 2 months, 6 months, I'll
50 years later.
yeah, it happened.
Yeah.
There's the one story, I'm trying to remember which one it was. It was The Odious Ogre, what I did. That took me about 40 years before I took out the envelope and said, oh, I think I know what to do with this.
Never throw
But
it.
I make notes in regular pencils, color pencils. I do big, I do small, I do diagrams, I'll do pictures, there'll be arrows all over the place. There'll be little notes and different things. And they, when I take them out, I understand exactly where I was in my thinking because of the visual aspect of it.
When you look at this room, what do you think about the range of ages of people who love your books?
They're all the same age to me. I don't think so. That's one of the great pleasures, yeah. I didn't know really. I was writing a book that people would characterize as a children's book. I didn't know what it was, except it fascinated me. The more I went into it, and it was partly, I think, it got me into a place that I didn't want to be. The toll booth, as I think, is a device, really, for carrying the story forward. I didn't want it to be literal in the sense that you knew that the toll booth was going to keep going on for the rest of eternity, always, you know, to people. It was an idea that at some time in almost everybody's life, something will happen. You will think of something, you'll observe something, some idea will cross your mind that you've never heard of before, or you've never thought about, and it sort of transforms your way of thinking or seeing something. There are all kinds of experiential things that, I guess the only word that describes them best is an epiphany. That's a good word, mostly used religiously, but it doesn't have to be. It's something that happens in your life that has the potential to change your life completely. And that's the way I view that. I didn't necessarily want it to be thought of as only a toll booth, and frankly, I didn't have a way that I wanted to explain all of that. Because you just don't know. There are people who have these things that don't do anything about them, and they disappear, and their life doesn't change at all. There are people to whom that's the important thing that has happened in their life, and they do change. And you can't predict it, you know.
I maybe spoke this up, but didn't you tell me that you wanted to end it with a fairy?
Oh, yes, I did want to, because of a wordplay thing. I have a little story for you. Thank you, I almost forgot. And this will only take an hour and a half. It's somewhere in the back of it. I always take this notebook everywhere. It's not that I use it, but it's my security blanket. Somewhere back here. There was a character, an American author and entertainer, who in the 1940s had a radio program. You remember radio. And his name, the name he took, his stage name, was Colonel Lemuel Q. Stoopnagle. And he liked to play with words. I mean, this is like, I hope I can find this damn thing. I know it's back here. It's here. Where is it? It's in one of these folders. Oh God, where did I put it? Yeah, here it is. And he used to take the classic fairy tales and translate them into what he called spoonerisms. I don't know whether any of you know what a spoonerism is. It's a way of changing the words or order of words in a text to totally alter the meaning. And they were very funny, some of them. And I got several of his books that he did. And I loved most of them. He did one based on Cinderella. I didn't like the way he did it, so I redid it on my own. And I'm going to read you this, and it comes with a moral too, so you won't go away not getting anything important. It's called Prinderella and the Since. Twice upon a whime, in a kistant dingdom, there was a gritty little pearl named Prinderella, who lived with her two sugly isters and her stick-it-wet mother, who made her pine the shots and shans and do all the other wordy dirk around the house. Well, the two sugly isters and the stick-it-wet mother, oh no, I'm sorry, let me go back one. Well, one day the king issued a proclamation ordering all the eligible earls to the palace for a Drancy Fest ball. Well, the two sugly isters and the stick-it-wet mother were going, but Prinderella couldn't go because she didn't have a Drancy Fest. All she had was a wordy dag that didn't dit. Wasn't that a shirty dame? Well, along came Prinderella's Gary Fodmother, who changed a pumpkin into a poach, and some hyce into morses, and her wordy dag into a Drancy Fest, and said, "Be sure to come back on the moke of Stridnight." So Prinderella bent to the wall, and she pranced all night with the Since. On the Moke of Stridnight, she ran down the Stalus Peps. On the bottom pep, she slopped her dripper. Well, next day, the king issued another proclamation ordering all the eligible earls to the palace to sly on the tripper. The two Sugliisters and the Stickit Wet Mother slided on. Didn't did. But Prinderella's finey tooth fid did. So on that very dame say, Prinderella and the Sense might garried and lived happily ever after. Now, the moral, which is, I can do in two ways. I think I'll do it there are too many young people here. I will do it the way it is written in ordinary English. You can translate it for yourself. If the shoe fits, wear it. But you will never hear Cinderella, the story of Cinderella again, and think about it the same way. And that's what I love about wordplay. It gives you a whole different world to think about and a whole different attitude. And it's quite wonderful. We tend to dismiss it as something frivolous, but it really isn't. It's quite important. Anyway, thank you all very much.